Well, good morning, at least for me. I don't know when you'll be watching this, but good morning. This is a video for week 5. I'm going to be talking about Four Horizons. We've been sort of looking at culture and cultural lenses, tried to unpack a little bit about the context in which Scripture itself functions, culture in biblical context, etc., how all that might affect the whole process of communicating the gospel and ultimately making disciples, that sort of thing. What I want to do today, and we've talked about cognitive theories of communication and some of the additional complicating factors that all that stuff weaves together. So today I want to look a little bit at a model for how we begin to weave all that together into sort of processing what we find in Scripture as we're trying to bridge that in terms of another culture. This won't be very tactically oriented or step-by-step oriented. It's simply trying to put a few pieces on the table that could help serve as a process for going about that. Some things to keep in mind as we're making those shifts. And this assumes that one of the core discipleship values and outcomes would be that as disciples emerge in another culture, that they are able, within the context of their culture, to also engage Scripture in a way that begins to speak and transform and make sense within their own context as they make decisions about what obedient discipleship means and all those sorts of things. So what are some of the factors involved with that, and where's our own place in that grand scheme? So I've titled this Four Horizons, and that really comes from the whole field of hermeneutics and biblical interpretation, where historically, in the older days, probably without anybody thinking about it, the assumption was that there was probably one horizon, meaning there's the text, here's us, there's nothing in between, there's just one horizon. Over time, a guy named Gadamer and early explorations of hermeneutics and meaning later summarized actually in a book by the title Two Horizons by Anthony Thistleton. Really tried to explore the fact that it's obviously a lot more complicated. There's us and our horizons, our backgrounds, our worldviews, all the stuff we've been exploring so far in the class. And then there's the horizon of the text, or the world of the text, the world, my world. Some of the authors have talked about worlds in front of the text, behind the text, et cetera, et cetera. So two horizons. But even that is actually a bit simplistic. An author and missiologist by the name of Harvey Conn, C-O-N-N, without really using the term horizons, posited three horizons, really, my terminology. So there's sort of the text, and then there's me, and then there's the culture that I'm trying to communicate with. So he was really starting to realize that I, as an interpreter working in another context and trying to bridge text to context, I'm also in a horizon, so there's at least three. More recently, I think 4 or 5 years ago, a book came out co-authored by Daniel Shaw, who is a Fuller two Fuller related professors, although I believe that Dan at this point, I believe, officially is in retirement. So Dan Shaw, who was actually on my PhD committee, and Charles Van Ingen, very famous biblical missiologist there at Fuller, co-authored a book in which they look at four horizons. And actually, that's a bit of a misnomer. They actually illuminate lots of sub-horizons within the text, but they talk about four horizons. And they talk about the first two horizons being the horizons of the biblical texts, and they see two there. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. and the way that the New Testament is actually representing the Old Testament. I'll dig more into that in a moment, because actually there's multiple horizons inside the biblical texts. And so those are the first two, Old Testament, New Testament. The second that they see is actually the horizon of the interpreter or the communicator, the person doing the evangelism and discipleship in a cross-cultural context, in the context of this course. And behind that is, of course, my whole, if I'm that person, it's not just my personal horizon, but as a believer, I've got a whole Christian context that is part of my horizon. It would include my denominational background, stuff I've studied, influences in my life, things I'm reacting against in my Christian background. So there's my culture, but there's also my whole Christian culture as well. And then there's, of course, the horizon of the people with whom we're trying to communicate or share the gospel. I used that model as a framework as I was looking at Bible translation, for example, in my doctoral work, where the translator is, of course, bringing into the whole process their own background, assumptions about exegesis, assumptions about interpretation, assumptions about what a passage must mean to fit with church doctrine. And that can vary depending on one's denominational background. And so really kind of trying to illuminate that the whole linguistic focus, that meaning is found somehow in the words and in the grammar, is too limited. There's just a whole lot of other stuff that we bring into that is going to shape even what we decide the grammar and vocabulary are telling us in the biblical text. And then, of course, figuring out how to communicate that in such a way that a person in another cultural context can understand it. You'll remember, perhaps, the lecture that I did, the video about cognitive environment and sort of communication and how all that pings. So in that case, it was simply a story that I used to illuminate cognitive environments and how those mesh. In this particular video, assume that when I say horizon, I mean that whole world of cognitive environment. So there's actually multiple environments moving here. We see it in Scripture, as I mentioned, although Shaw and Van Ingen talk about two horizons in the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament. If you think about it, multiple. So, for example, the way Matthew and Luke are actually probably incorporating big chunks of Mark and adding in their own material. There's actually multiple cognitive environments going on. They're writing from and for different contexts themselves. John is a whole other animal, using the same traditions but coming at it from a very different perspective, and all of them having other cultural pieces speaking into that. Then you unpack the way that those same texts, the Gospels, are incorporating Old Testament material, the way Luke does it, and Matthew does it, and John does it, and Mark does it. It's actually very different, but they're drawing back into that. If you look within the Old Testament, there's whole layers of the way the texts that are, for example, Deuteronomy, the way that is actually looking back at a later time. Moses himself standing on the edge of the promised land, actually looking back at things that have already been written down and discussed in Exodus. So there's two horizons even there. Not quite as diverse, not quite as divergent, obviously, as some. But so even within the biblical text, incredibly complicated re-communication of biblical truth is going on even within the Bible. So just that may be a concept that's a bit new for some of us. I find that very exciting because what it does is it shows God at work as a communicator, using his own communication in new contexts, and the way that he shapes it so that a new community can understand it afresh is actually fascinating to me. And I'm really grateful for a God like that because it means he can talk to me, and I appreciate that. So, um, so there's the biblical text. There's me coming to that text, trying to understand it, and all those challenges. And then there's me trying to communicate now to a whole other people, and how to help them engage. In some ways, I would want to say that my goal would be for me to get out of the way so they can engage the text themselves. The problem is that's just never actually fully possible. I think the best that we can really do is to get self-aware of all of that, um, and understand that those dynamics are going on. That there's the texts, there's us, there's the new audience, etc. So it gets pretty complicated, and as you've been discovering throughout the class, as you know, um, from from your own experience as well. So yeah, I just want to kind of introduce us to that additional layer as we're looking at these at this this fifth week. As you're reading Credible Witness, continue to, I mean, really look at how the author's own horizon is impacting how they're viewing biblical material, and how there's a couple of different examples of communication events in which they're trying to share some things with other cultural contexts. So just kind of be observing that as you're reading, and but thinking too of the implications of that then for cross-cultural evangelism and discipleship. And we'll keep pressing on with the course. So enjoy the week. I look forward to seeing your posts online, and many blessings.